Hello, I'm your host, Brian Callanan. How is the Seattle City Council changing its approach to homeless encampment outreach? What are the top priorities for the budget right now in an unstable COVID-19 economy? And should the city repair or replace the West Seattle Bridge? Councilmembers Tammy Morales and Andrew Lewis answer these questions and the ones you're sending in too, next on Council Edition.
The notion that we need more police, an ever-growing force in order to increase public safety, is just a false notion.
There's sort of a myth out there that we have sort of all of this shelter vacancy and that people are refusing offers to go. And that is just manifestly not the case.
All that and more coming up next on City Inside Out, Council Edition. And here they are joining us, Councilmember Tammy Morales from District 2 from South Seattle up into the Chinatown ID. Also with us, Councilmember Andrew Lewis from District 7 covering downtown up to Magnolia. Now, I'm going to say this, while a lot of things have changed this year, one thing that hasn't changed is the city's need for a balanced budget. We're in the middle of that process right now, both of you serving your first year on the council. And Councilmember Morales, let me start with you. What is it like going through your first budget process so soon after the council had to rebalance the 2020 budget? I want to talk about the workload, your outreach to the public, and your priorities too, please.
Well, it is challenging, to say the least. You know, we just came out of 3 months, really, of talking about progressive revenue and how to rebalance the 2020 budget. So we had a little bit of a break and are right back at it. So, you know, we are hearing from a lot of constituents. We're hearing from advocates and organizations who are doing really important work on the ground. And it's just an exciting time, I'll say.
Let me jump in with one piece with you, Councilmember Morales, if I can. I know you've had some concern, other council members have too, about what the mayor has presented, $100 million for BIPOC communities, trying to wrestle with that amount, trying to make sure that you're able to come through with something there for our BIPOC communities. I know it's important to you, and I know there's been a lot of back and forth between the council and the mayor about this. Could you talk about your approach to that issue, please?
Sure. Well, you know, the importance from my perspective and the way that I have talked about how I will make decisions about the budget is really following the principles that I ran on and the principles that we use in our office when we're making decisions, which are that we want to make sure we're repairing the harm done to Black and Brown communities, particularly in the South End. We want to democratize access to power and resources, which is why we're really advocating for participatory budgeting, for example. And then we want to make sure that we're planning for the seventh generation so that the work that we're doing is about looking at, for example, building policies and transportation policies, and really thinking about how to move toward a green economy and move away from a reliance on fossil fuel as a city. Those are just some of the lenses that I use as I'm thinking about how to make decisions and how to prioritize what our office is advocating for in the budget process.
Thank you very much for that. Councilmember Lewis, before we get into specifics, can we talk about your overall approach to the budget, how you've been working to get public input, and some of your top priorities this year as well?
Yeah, Brian, I appreciate being able to talk about that because throughout the entire year, one of my big priorities and focuses has been trying to get as much feedback and public opinion in the district as possible to shape the priorities of what the people of District 7 want to see reflected in the budget. And, you know, I've had constituent meetings on a weekly basis. I actually had them this morning for this week. Several hundred hours of one-on-one constituent time, several town meetings that are all available on my website covering a variety of different topics throughout the year, including public safety, tax equity, all sorts of different subjects that we've been tackling. And I think, you know, what I've really been hearing from the public and what I really want to see is I think we got to tackle three issues and have the budget be really a roadmap to how we're going to get through this moment of immense challenge in the city of Seattle. And I think first, we got to continue our efforts on recovery, relief, and response to COVID. as one of the first priorities. We got to continue to stand up our testing and tracing. We have to continue to stand up support for small businesses, relief for people who are suffering from unemployment, food access. All of that is something we have a massive role in as a city, and we need to keep that centered to get through this crisis. Second, chronic homelessness. And this is something we'll talk about later in the show, but making sure we're standing up additive shelter, tiny house villages, hoteling, the things that we need to be getting people inside in a place where they can be safe, in a place where they can be warm. And then third, I think that we really need to make sure that we are taking the first steps on completely reforming, changing, overhauling our public safety system in a way that is going to center equity, that's going to respond to public health hazards and crisis in a more responsive way, and that is going to reflect the change that we all want to see in our public safety system and make those first steps there. So I think those are my three big priorities, and that's what I've been hearing from the people in my district.
Thanks very much for that. And Councilmember Lewis, I'm going to stick with you and dive into this homelessness issue if I could. I want to talk about a proposal the council is set to approve here in October for the Unsheltered Outreach and Response Team, the UORT. And if I'm mispronouncing that, I know we're still getting used to some of these ideas here. But this is a group that would essentially replace the navigation team, which has handled this kind of work for the past 3 years in Seattle. And the involvement of police officers in this group, the way they were used to remove camps in the NAV team there. I know that raised some concerns, so your new plan does not involve police officers, and we've seen some feedback about that. Let me give you one example here. I work in social services with homeless, the writer writes. Throwing more social workers ain't going to solve the problem. Please respond to that question if you could and talk about this new team concept you've come up with.
Well, I feel like I need a little more context to respond to whatever that person was referring to. So I don't know that that's quite enough information for me to know what their particular issue is. But I will say generally, first off, I would take a step back and say it's not necessarily my proposal. It's my bill to put forward this new team, but it's the synthesis of feedback, of participation from a lot of different folks to kind of get to this point, some of which is based in principled compromise, some of which is based in responding to those long-term criticisms. So let me just break it down a little bit on what it is. There's a broad consensus that we've reached between the providers, between people on the council, and between the mayor's office, that the police should not be used as agents of outreach to people who are living unsheltered anymore. That does not mean that the police should not respond to encampments when there are crimes happening or when there are public safety hazards. But in terms of the outreach to make offers of services, to make offers of shelter, that was not an appropriate or desirable use of sworn law enforcement officers. So what we are doing is pivoting in this proposal to have the outreach be done by the outreach professionals in the provider community, and that those folks in turn will coordinate with a team that is back at HQ, for lack of a better term, who will coordinate with the providers that are out in the field, who will make sure they have the resources they need to be successful, who will coordinate with other city departments. If Seattle Public Utilities needs to get in a sink, for example, to a location, or a portable toilet or hygiene facilities, maybe if Parks needs to go in and do sharps removal, some of the things that only the city can do, and really bring those resources out so providers can be more impactful. I want to stress this is the beginning. This isn't the end of this conversation. Councilmember Morales has brought forward proposals in particular that we're discussing for 2021 and how this might go forward. I know the mayor and providers have some of their thoughts too on some other strategies, but this is really, Brian, a proposal just to finish out the last 2 months of the year of 2020. Yeah. And then through this budget process, we will be shaping, what is the long-term strategy going to be beyond that. But in the meantime, let's get providers out in the field. Let's get money for additive shelter and more services. And let's really start tackling this exigent crisis with a sense of urgency.
Thanks very much for that. And Councilmember Morales, if you want to comment on what's happening here in 2020, that's great. I want to look forward to 2021 too. And I know you have a proposal you're working on, the Homelessness Outreach Provider Ecosystem, or HOPE. And Councilmember Lewis, you could learn a few things about acronyms from Councilmember Morales. I'm just going to say that out loud. But I just want to bottom line it for viewers.
Because that acronym was from the mayor's office in that bill.
All right. All right. Fair enough. I just wanted to talk about this because I think we're trying to bottom line it for viewers. They don't necessarily care what the name of the program is. We actually had one person write in about this. Can we expect any significant changes to the increased presence of tents in public spaces this year or next? Councilmember Morales, I'll go to you on this. How do you respond to that question, and how do you want to guide the city's homelessness outreach efforts?
Sure. Well, this is the issue that we have been dealing with we are in the fifth year of a homelessness crisis. And I know how frustrated people are, right? Whether you're mad about uh, people being on the street and there being needles and trash in the street, or whether you're mad that people have had to endure for 5 years with insufficient support, we know that folks across the city are frustrated with the situation. And to your writer, I will say that social workers are not the only solution. They're not even the primary solution to this problem. The way we're going to deal with our homelessness crisis is to build substantially more housing that people can afford. And the permanent supportive housing that those who are chronically homeless need to be able to find some stability and get off the street. Until that is built, then we are left with the need to mitigate as much as possible for the folks who are going to be living outside for, I will say through next year. We do have more tiny house villages that have been funded. We have, as Andrew said, ideas about putting folks in hotels. We can certainly do more enhanced shelters. But until all of that is in place, we need to make sure that we are treating our neighbors with dignity and humanity, and doing what we can to make things as smooth as possible for everybody involved. So yes, the program that we have proposed, the HOPE program, which stands for Homelessness Outreach Provider Ecosystem, really is about focusing and doing providing service in a way that really centers the expertise of our outreach workers. I was out in Georgetown and Soto over the last few days and saw for myself how they do outreach, how they provide clothing, services, connection to housing. I did speak with a couple of folks last night who are finally on the list and will be getting housing through a
Yeah.
lottery system. But for in terms of the HOPE program itself, it really does allow officers and other first responders to go into dangerous situations
Mhm.
if encampments warrant it. So, but I think the critical part here is that it is not a wholesale eviction of the entire encampment. It is only the person or persons who are involved. We wouldn't evict an entire apartment building if there is one person who's doing drugs in one unit, for
Yeah,
example.
got it.
This idea really came from the summer budget process, where we were shifting from service to funding service providers. And after several weeks of conversation with providers, with the executive, um, in my mind, this really completes that transition from an experiment that didn't work to a new expert-led and much more collaborative approach. And I do believe really responds to what we're hearing from homeless folks themselves and from the providers who want to be able to have access to the resources and to the shelter information without having to jump through a bunch of hoops and go through a really Byzantine process in order to help
Sure.
get people off the streets.
Thanks for that. I know we could talk a lot more about this team, but let's try to shift this conversation on homelessness, if we could, to some of these longer term ways to house people who are unsheltered. And Councilmember Lewis, I wanted to talk about tiny home villages. Seem like they're taking a really big piece here when we're looking at the homelessness response for the city of Seattle. Can you talk about your plan? And Councilmember Morales, I know I'll have you jump in too. Councilmember Lewis, I'll start with you.
I'm happy to talk about the tiny houses. I think that there's actually a consensus among the council, the mayor, the provider community. Everyone agrees that the tiny house villages have performed exceptionally well in providing a place that is highly desirable from people living unsheltered in the city of Seattle to accept offers to go to tiny house villages. People in tiny house villages have a very high track record of success of transitioning into permanent supportive housing from them. And we only have about 325 tiny houses in the whole system. There's sort of a myth out there that we have sort of all of this shelter vacancy and that people are refusing offers to go. And that is just manifestly not the case. People will, Chloe Gale at Reach always says, If people are offered something better, they will take something better. Tiny houses are undoubtedly a really good intervention. But I do just want to caution, Brian.
Mhm.
No one thinks tiny houses are a permanent housing placement. It's a place for folks to go for a few months in order to get all their ducks in a row to get into permanent supportive housing where they can stay indefinitely. And that is where the real bottleneck is how can we get more permanent supportive housing? There's a plan from the Third Door Coalition that estimates it'll cost about $1.5 billion over 5 years. And
Yeah.
we've got to be realistic. It's not cheap. There's ways to drive down those costs and make it cheaper. But at the end of the day, that's why we put forward the Jumpstart Seattle tax. That's why King County is moving forward with their councilmatic sales tax authority to build and acquire hotels on a permanent basis for permanent supportive housing. These are the kind of regional efforts that we need.
Yeah. And Councilmember Morales, let me go to you on this. And if I could add a wrinkle, I know you're concerned about tiny home villages too. You'd like to see more coming to District 2. Specifically, though, I know there's this group around North Lake that's had a tiny home village there for a while. They've been self-run. They've had some back and forth with the city over the last couple years here. You're trying to bring them down to District 2, as I understand it. And help me out with this, because a self-managed tiny home village introduces some new aspects to it. And I'd like for you to break that down, please.
The folks up in North Lake are trying to move and have expressed an interest in coming to District 2.
Hmm.
But the idea is really to add some diversity to the ecosystem of tiny house villages. So there
Okay.
are some that are have more structure, that have service providers who are part of it, case management. That is how they are managed. And then there are others who prefer to have their own security system, their own way of managing and kind of screening the way residents come in and out. And it really is just giving people a little bit of autonomy, frankly, and the ability to live in a more secure place, but without having restrictions, which frankly you and I, as people who live in our own homes, don't
Hmm.
have to abide by.
Yeah.
And so it really is about allowing folks to have a self-managed structure. And we are supporting the idea not just of this particular community, but of other folks. As you've mentioned, as Andrew mentioned, there are lots of council members who want to see more tiny house villages as options for getting folks off the street. And you know, as many times as I've been to a homeless encampment and talked to folks, when I ask if they would move into a tiny house village if it was an option, everybody says yes.
Hmm.
And in fact, many people have already been on lists for quite some time and are
Sure.
eager to be able to move into something that gives them a little bit more stability.
Got it. So that self-management piece is certainly going to be a big discussion going forward. I need to switch gears because there's a big issue around the police budget we need to tackle. Councilmember Lewis, I'll start with you. The SPD has recently revealed that 110 officers have left the department over the past year for various reasons. The number of SPD officers now at the lowest that the department has seen since at least 2010. Viewers have some concerns here too. Here's one from Twitter we got in about this. With violent crime rates, including murder, increasing in 2020, why is Councilmember Lewis advocating for defunding Seattle PD and fewer officers when he campaigned on the need for Seattle to have more officers? And Councilmember Lewis, you and I have engaged on this issue before here. I want to talk about police staffing funding, what you make of this significant drop in the number of officers right now.
Yeah, Brian. Well, we've obviously seen that attrition has been high, and the council in the summer anticipated actually that we were probably going to have high attrition for a lot of different reasons. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
hiring freeze that is in place that the executive and the police chief have put in place, so there's not going to be hiring of new officers, and the police service in any city, not just Seattle, police have a tough job. They have a high attrition
Mhm.
rate.
Yeah.
So when there's a hiring freeze, that's going to have a big impact. I
Yep.
think what's important is looking at, and this is, I think, something that the council has really been doing a good job of evaluating, is really looking at the functions of what the police do. Because
Mhm.
I agree with the person that tweeted in to an extent that when there's an exigent public safety threat, when there's an active shooter, but when there's something that where we need to send an armed and sworn officer, they should have the ability to respond to a crisis like that. I think
Hmm.
that what we're seeing and where there's a lot of issues in the community is, if someone is having some kind of public health related situation, like should we be sending an armed and sworn officer? Lots of cities, lots of countries, lots of communities don't do this. When I was running as a candidate, I was not aware of how broad the scope of nonviolent, non-criminal things the police respond to was. 56% of the
Hmm.
calls are non-criminal calls. And then
Right.
actually, Brian, increasingly, like even in that 44% that is criminal, like we got a letter from the parking enforcement union the other day saying they're interested in taking on responding to car prowl cases. They're interested in taking on and doing, guiding traffic at sporting events.
Mm.
All of the things that parking enforcement officers, which are 60% BIPOC, 50% women, very diverse bargaining unit, they could take
Mm.
on almost 20% by some estimates of the functions that are currently exclusively done by SPD. So look,
Mm.
like there's ways to do this right. The answer is not more police officers necessarily, because the police budget's gone up 44% in the last 5 years, but I don't know that that's made us 44% safer. So I think we really need to start looking very critically at, carving out the things that we absolutely need sworn officers to do, because there are things we need them to do. But there's a lot of stuff we don't, and let's hand that off to other services so they can focus on the work they need to do, and leave some of the other stuff to other first responders that could do that work instead.
Got it. Thanks for that. Councilmember Morales, more public feedback on this. We've gotten a ton of this. One person writes, I pay taxes in Seattle and I vote in Seattle. I want more police, not less. Your response to this, and tell us what you want to see with the police budget in 2021 going forward.
Well, like Andrew said, just the notion that we need more police, an ever growing force in order to increase public safety is just a false notion. There is nothing no research that indicates that a large police force increases community safety at all. And the truth of the matter is that when we're talking about community safety, when we're talking about public safety, the question is safety for whom, right? Because I represent South Seattle, where many people do not, in fact, feel safe having extra police in the neighborhood. So, there is, and there is the additional paradox of communities of color being both over policed and under policed. So
Mm.
I think this look that we're taking as a council at what the functions are of the department are really important. And I also think it's important that we honor communities of color by listening to them and acknowledging what they're saying about how they perceive community safety. So
Mm.
when we're talking about, wanting to shift funds from the police department into community investment, part of what we need to do is look at how are we spending our money now? What is the resource allocation? The police department has a $400 million budget. When you look at the departments that are, might be considered the community investment departments, their budgets together are less than $200,000. So
Mm.
Department of Neighborhoods, the Office of Economic Development, the Office of Housing, the Office of Planning and Community Development combined have budgets of $185 million. So
Right.
we need to take a serious look at what problems are we seeing. If we're seeing crime on the streets, if we're seeing, youth violence, if we're seeing people who are tearing down the street, speeding, whatever the issues
Yeah.
are, what is the cause of that? And the way to fix some of these problems is not to arrest people faster. The way to fix these problems is to invest in the communities where these people come from so that they have greater stability, greater housing security, greater food security, access to good jobs, quality education. This is how we change the dial, is to really support our neighbors in having healthy, thriving communities. And then we will start to see and understand that those upstream investments are well worth it.
Got it. Thanks very much for that. I'm going to wrap up with a question to you both about an important transportation issue, not directly connected to the budget, but I'm sure it will be once we get a few bits more information here. Talking about the West Seattle Bridge, one of the many emergencies facing our city right now. And Mayor Durkin has a big decision coming up over this with regard to repairing or replacing it. Councilmember Morales, I'll start with you. A big issue in your district, especially around Georgetown, traffic issues, environmental concerns there. It looks like a repair might cost less and get traffic flowing more quickly, but a replacement could be more reliable and might even cost less in the long run. What do you want the mayor to be considering in her choice, and what do you support, repair or replace?
Well, I think, it is important to recognize that the folks who live in Georgetown are in somewhat of an island. There are traffic implications for what's happening now as we see, hundreds of thousands, well, 100,000 more daily car trips are anticipated to go through, especially as folks are starting to go back into work downtown. There is already an air quality issue in Georgetown. In fact, the average lifespan there is 13 years less than in other neighborhoods in the city. And so, the increased traffic is a problem, not just in terms of street safety, public safety, but in terms of the air quality implications there. And on top of that, other neighborhoods enjoy, the resilience of having a grocery store, a library, a community center.
Sure.
The folks in Georgetown don't have that. And so, as I was talking to one Georgetown resident who said the bridge makes Georgetown livable because that is how they get to the medical center and to the grocery store. So I do think that, mostly what I hear is fix it faster.
I bet.
But we need to make sure that there are mitigations in place, signal timing, turn lanes, repaving, so that we can connect people better. And then the last thing I'll say about it is that there are also many who are looking for mitigation that is car free. And so folks want to be able to get to South Park, which is why I'm advocating for the completion of the Georgetown to South Park Trail, which would be a pedestrian and bike path across the Duwamish to give folks another way to get around.
All right, Councilmember Lewis, I'll go to you next here. I know a number of your constituents in Magnolia are keeping a very close eye on this. They've been waiting around for a new bridge for some time here. I'd like to get your thoughts on what you'd like the mayor to be considering with this West Seattle Bridge consideration here. And do you support repair or replace? Your thoughts?
Yeah, so Brian, I think that what I'm really going to want to hear from are the experts on the merits of both of those projects as it comes before the council. I think it's too early to say one way or the other because we haven't been presented with all of the information yet. It's also going to be really important to me to hear from my colleague, Councilmember Herbold, who represents that district, and what the people of the district in West Seattle want. Like if they want to have the more expedient repair, or if they want to take their time with the replacement and the potential long-term benefits of that. So I want to see what that give and take is. I think as a broader point, I would just say, Councilmember Peterson put forward an audit in the summer, which came back and indicated we have a lot of bridges that are having a lot of issues with them, including the Magnolia Bridge in my district. And I would like to see an effort to engage in a citywide policy that continues to strive towards the types of investments we should be making in long-term bridge maintenance to avoid future issues like what's happened in West Seattle, and to make sure that a lot of these neighborhood bridges, like the Magnolia Bridge, like some of the other bridges that were on that list, the Ballard Bridge is coming up soon as something we're going to have to seriously be considering about replacing on the horizon. The bridges are necessary infrastructure improvements in the city, and we need to have a comprehensive plan, and we need to have enough money in on our end to attract the federal and state dollars necessary to make big infrastructure projects like that fly.
All right. Thank you very much, both of you, for your input here. And folks, the final public hearing on the budget happens at 5:30 p.m., October 27th. You can catch that virtual meeting right here on Seattle Channel. Get your input in as well. I'll continue to follow up on the budget process as it wraps up in November. Thanks to both the council members. We'll see you next time.